Welcome back to Thomas Tessier's World of Hurt. I'm Chris L. McKenna. Today's story was first published in the anthology Post-Mortem, New Tales of Ghostly Horror, edited by Paul F. Olson and David B. Silva in 1989, and is narrated by Paul Giamatti.
Blanca by Thomas Tessier. When I told a few close friends that I was going to Blanca, their reaction was about what I had expected. Why? They asked. There's nothing to see in Blanca. Nothing much to do except disappear. Sly smiles. Watch out you don't disappear. Maybe that's why I chose it, I said with a smile of my own. Might be nice to disappear for a while. For a travel writer who has been on the job 10 years as I have, it isn't so easy to escape. The good places have been done, the mediocre ones, too. You name it, and I've probably been there, evaluating the hotels, sampling the cuisine, checking out the facilities and amenities, chatting up the locals. It's a great job, but I was tired of the regular world. What I needed was a therapeutic getaway. Spend a couple of weeks in an obscure backwater doing nothing more than sipping cold beer on a terrace and reading a good book. I knew people in the business who'd been to Blanca. It's boring, they told me. Miles and miles of rolling plains and rangeland. There was a dead volcano somewhere in Blanca, but it wasn't worth climbing. Yes, the towns were neat and the people were pleasant enough. There's never any difficulty getting a clean room and a bed for the night in Blanca, but nothing happens. There's nothing to do. No monuments or ancient ruins, no lively carnival, no festivals or feasts. The nightlife is said to be fairly low-key, so if you're looking for that kind of action, which I wasn't, there are much better places to go. Blanca was cattle country, and the only good thing I ever heard about it was that the steaks were excellent. Blanca is not a nation, but a territory overlapping several borders in that region of the world. The native Indians were crushed nearly 2 centuries ago. They still survive, a sullen minority now thoroughly domesticated by generations of servitude as cheap labor cowhands, meat packers, and household help. The European settlers tried to create Blanca as an independent state, but numerous rebellions failed and it was eventually carved up by its larger neighbors. But Blanca is Blanca, they say, regardless of the boundaries that appear on maps. Because Blanca has comparatively little to offer the visitor, it is not on any of the main routes. I had to catch 2 flights, the second of which stopped at so many featureless outposts along the way that it seemed like days before I finally got to Oraniennes. With a population of nearly 100,000, it is easily the largest city in Blanca. I checked into the Hotel des Vacances, which was within walking distance of the central district, but just far enough away to escape the noise. My room was large and airy, had a small balcony that overlooked 2 residential streets and a park. It was comfortable, and not at all like a modern luxury hotel. I slept for nearly 11 hours that first night, had steak and eggs for brunch, and then took a lazy walk around the center of Oraniennes. The narrow side streets had a certain pioneer charm. The original hard clay tiles had never been paved over and remained neatly in place. But the most remarkable feature of the city was its state of cleanliness. I began to look for a piece of litter and couldn't find so much as one discarded cigarette butt. It reminded me of Switzerland or Singapore. On the top floor of a department store, I caught a view of the southern part of the city. A vast stretch of stockyards, abattoirs, and railroad tracks. All the beef in Blanca passed through Oraniennes on its way to the outside world. I'd come to a dusty 3-story cow town, and it was the tidiest, best scrubbed place I'd ever seen. But then I'd heard stories about the police in Blanca. They were the law, and if you had any sense at all, you never challenged them. Littering ranked close to treason by their way of thinking. And while that might seem harsh to some, I had no problem with it. I've seen immaculate places and I've seen squalor. On the whole, I prefer the former. Besides, it had nothing to do with me. I was on vacation, recovering from a personal mess, exercising old demons, including a wife. The first few days I was in Iranian, the only cops I saw were chubby little men in silly uniforms directing traffic. They looked like stage extras in some Ruritanian operetta. Not them, Bosma said quietly. The ones you must worry about are the ones you can't see. The people in plain clothes. They are everywhere. Well, even here? I asked, amused but intrigued. Yes, surely. We were in the small but very pleasant beer garden behind the Hotel des Vacances. There were perhaps 24 other people scattered about the umbrella-topped tables in the late afternoon sun. A few neighborhood regulars, the rest visitors and hotel guests like myself passing through. Everyone looked fairly happy and relaxed. My companion was both a foreigner and a local resident. Bosma had taken it upon himself to join me at my table the day before, when I had just discovered the beer garden and was settling into the 13th Simeno omnibus. At first I resented the intrusion and tried to ignore the man, but he would not be denied. Finally I gave in and closed my book. We spent 2 hours or more drinking and chatting, with Bosma carrying most of the load. But he was easy company. A middle-aged Lebanese, he had reluctantly fled Beirut while he still had a cache of foreign currency. The city had become unbearable, impossible, and he believed he was a target of both the Christians, because I am a Muslim, and the Shiites, because they think all international businessmen are working for the CIA. Besides, business had pretty much dried up. Bosma had been in Iranian for the best part of 3 years, doing the odd bit of trade and otherwise depleting his capital. He was eager to move on to more fertile ground, but had not yet decided where that might be. By then I was tired and tipsy and went to bed early, but we agreed to meet again the next day and have dinner in town, which is how we came to be discussing the police. Who, for instance? I asked. Let's not be looking around and staring, Bosma said softly, but that couple at the table by the wall on your right. I have seen them many times and wondered about them. A handsome man and a beautiful woman, both in their late 20s. He wore a linen suit, a white shirt, and no tie. He had dark hair and a strong, unmarked face. She was dressed in a smart, obviously foreign outfit, skirt, matching jacket, and a stylish blouse. I imagined her to be the daughter of a local big shot. She had that air of privilege and hauteur. They made me feel old, or perhaps just envious of their youth and good looks. I don't care, I said. I'm just passing through. All I want to do is relax for a couple of weeks. Yeah, of course, Bosma smiled. So that night he gave me the grand tour of Iranian, such as it is. After the mandatory steak dinner, we strolled through the main shopping arcade, which was full of the latest European fashions and Asian electronic equipment, all carrying steep price tags. We took in a couple of bars, briefly surveyed a dance hall that doubled as an economy-class dating service, and then stopped for a while at a neon-riddled disco called Marlena's, where the crowd was somewhat interesting. There the sons and daughters of local wealth came to dance, flirt, play their social games, and get blitzed. Bosma called them the second raters because the brightest of their generation and class were away in America and England, at the best private schools and universities. By the time we'd squandered some money at a posh gambling club and had a disturbing glimpse of a very discreet place where you could do whatever you wanted with girls or boys as young as 13, I'd seen enough for one night. Iranian's dull and orderly exterior masked the usual wanton tendencies. It didn't bother me, but it didn't interest me. Back in my room, I poured one last nightcap from my bottle of duty-free single malt and lit a cigarette. I'd had a lot to drink, but it had been spaced out over many hours, with a meal thrown in somewhere along the line. I wasn't drunk, just tired, just reasonably buzzed. I know this for sure because whenever I have gotten drunk in the past, I've never dreamed, or at least I've never remembered it. That night, I I did have a dream, and it was one I wouldn't forget. I was sleeping in my bed there in the Hotel de Vacances. It was the middle of the night. Suddenly I was awakened by a loud clattering noise. I jumped out of bed in a fog. I was out the window, looking out at what seemed to be an historical costume pageant. It confused me, and I couldn't move. The street below, brightly lit by a three-quarters moon, was full of soldiers on horseback. They carried torches or waved swords. The horses continued to make a dreadful racket, stamping their feet on the clay tiles. Every house in sight remained dark, but the soldiers went to several different doors, roused the inhabitants, and seized 8 or 10 people altogether. They were thrown into horse-drawn carts already crowded with prisoners. The night was full of terrible sounds. The soldiers shouting, men arguing or pleading in vain, their women and children wailing, a ghastly pandemonium. It seemed they'd finished and were about to move on when one of the soldiers, obviously an officer, turned and looked up directly at me. Now, I was standing on the little balcony, gripping the wrought iron tightly. The officer spoke to one of his comrades who also looked in my direction. Then the officer raised his sword, pointing to me. I knew his face, but I had no idea who he was. A small group of soldiers, apparently responding to the instructions, hurried across the street toward the hotel. Still, I couldn't move. A terrible fear came over me as I realized they would take me away with the others. The rest is sensation, twisting, falling, hideous sweetness we all dream about more than we would like before it actually happens. Our moment of dying. I slept late. It was becoming a welcome habit, and woke up feeling remarkably cheerful and energetic. I remembered the dream. I thought about it all through my shower, over brunch, and during my walk to the newsstand for the most recent Herald Tribune. I sat outdoors at a quiet cafe, had 2 cups of gritty coffee, smoked cigarettes, and read the sports scores from a few days ago in my distant homeland. It felt great to be alive. Any sense of menace or fear had dissolved out of the dream. It had already become a kind of mental curio that I carried around with me. Maybe I was happy simply because I knew I could never have had that nightmare in New York. What it seemed to say in the light of day was, "Now you know you're in Blanca." It's local history, Bosma agreed when we met in the beer garden later that afternoon, and I told him about the dream. You must have known about it before you came here. Sure, well, vaguely. I lit a cigarette while an Indian waitress delivered our second round of beers. I've heard the jokes about people being taken away in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Yes, but they are not jokes. What you dreamed is exactly how it used to happen. By the way, it still does from time to time. Really? Of course. Well, that's politics, which never interested me. Just as soon get back to dreaming about sex. Bosma smiled broadly. No need just to dream about it. Dreaming will do for now. Bosma shrugged sadly. I knew I was doing a pretty poor job of living up to his mental image of American tourists as people hell-bent on having an extravagantly good time. We had a light dinner together, and then I disappointed him further by deciding to make an early evening of it. I was still a bit tired from our night out on the town, and I wanted nothing more than to read in bed for a while and then get about 12 hours of sleep. I had it in mind to rent a car the next day and see a bit of the nearby countryside, however flat and dull it might prove to be. Simenon worked his usual magic. I was soon transported to rainy Paris. Even in the sweltering heat of August, Simenon's Paris seems rainy, where Inspector Maigret had another nasty murder to unravel. It was bliss, but unfortunately I drifted off to sleep sooner than I expected. I woke up a little after 4 in the morning, still dressed, the paperback in my hand. I dropped the book to the floor and crawled under the covers. But it was no good. Finally, I sat up and groaned, realizing that I would not be able to get back to sleep. For a while, I simply stayed there, lying still. I got out of bed when I noticed a strange flickering of light reflected on the half-open window. It came from the street below, a lamp post or car headlights most likely, but when I stepped out onto the balcony and looked down, I was paralyzed by what I saw. They were all there again. The horses, the carts, the soldiers with their swords and torches, the pitiful souls being dragged from their homes, the mothers and wives, the children. It was a repeat performance of the grim nightmare I'd had only 24 hours ago, but this time I was wide awake. I forced myself to be sure. I took note of the cold, harsh, wrought iron beneath my bare feet. I sucked in huge breaths of chilly night air, and I looked over my shoulder into the hotel room to reassure myself in some way. But when I turned back to the street below, they were still there. The scene continued to play itself out. I was awake, and it was happening. I realized that there were certain differences. Noise. There was none at all. The horses stamped, the soldiers shouted, the men argued, and their families sobbed, but I heard none of this. I could only see it taking place. Silence ruled the night. And then there was the officer, the one in charge who had pointed his sword at me in the dream. I spotted him again, and he still looked familiar to me, but I didn't know who he was. This time he never once glanced in my direction. He and his troops went about their business as if I didn't exist, though they could hardly fail to notice me standing there on the second-floor balcony, the room lit up behind me. The fact that they didn't may account for the other difference, the lack of fear in me. The scene had a terrible fascination. I was transfixed by it, but at the same time, I felt detached from it, uninvolved. I didn't know what to make of it. I felt puzzled rather than threatened. Finally, I did something sensible. I looked up the street, away from the scene, and sure enough, I saw the usual line of parked cars that I knew belonged there. It was a comforting sight. But then when I turned back, the dream drama was still just visible. The soldiers and the carts had formed a wavy line and were marching away from me toward the main road, 100 yards or so in the distance. I watched them until they reached the intersection with that broad avenue, at which point my eyes could make out nothing more than the bobbing, meandering flow of torch flames. It took another few minutes for me to realize that what I was looking at was a stream of headlights. Then I became aware of the sound of that traffic. The silence was broken. The early shift, I told myself. Hundreds of workers on their way to the abattoirs, stockyards, and packing plants on the south side of the city. The news agents, short-order cooks and bus drivers, all the people who open up the city before dawn every morning. Any city. I stepped back into the room, sat on my bed, and lit a cigarette, wondering how yesterday's nightmare could turn into today's hallucination. "Do you take drugs?" Basma asked me casually. We were walking through the park toward a bar I'd never been to in my life. It was about 5 that afternoon, and I blurted out the story of the hallucination, which was what I still took it to be, as soon as we met for our daily drink and chat. I laughed. "No, it's been a few years since I did any drugs, and even then it wasn't much." "You are quite certain that you were fully awake when you saw this, whatever it was?" "Yes." "And you were awake before you saw it?" "Definitely. I was lying there, feeling sorry for myself for waking up so early. I saw the orange light flickering on the window. It's a glass door, actually, to the balcony." Yes, Basma said impatiently. "Well, like I told you, I sat up and went to the window. I stepped out onto the balcony, and there it was." "I see." Basma didn't speak again until we reached the bar, a workers' grog shop that offered only the locally brewed beer Bolero. Once we got our drinks and I had a cigarette, Basma returned to the subject. So you think it was hallucination? Yes, of course, I said. What else would it be? Ghosts. Bosma smiled faintly, not as if he were joking. Perhaps you saw the ghosts of history. Oh, I doubt that very much. Why, it makes perfect sense. What is more, I think you may have been awake the first time you saw them, 2 nights ago. You only thought it was a dream. You were less certain because it was the first time, and you had been drinking more, yes? Yes, I had been drinking more, but I still think that I was dreaming. It ended in a panic, and I was lost in sleep in an instant. No sensation of getting back into bed or thinking about it. I stubbed out my cigarette and lit another. I didn't like disappointing Bosma, and he seemed as eager as a young child to believe in ghosts. Besides, even if I were awake, that doesn't mean it was not an hallucination. The same hallucination 2 nights in a row. Bosma gave this some thought. You have a medical history of this? No, not at all, I had to admit. Then why do you think it should suddenly start happening to you now? I shrugged. Maybe the stories I'd heard about Blanca? The emotional distress from the breakup of my marriage, throw in the mild despair I sometimes feel at the approach of my 40th birthday. I finished the beer and realized how self-pitying I sounded, and it annoyed me very much. To tell you the truth, I really have no idea at all why this kind of thing should be suddenly happening to me. Hallucination? Bosma asked again quietly. That makes a lot more sense than an army of ghosts. As long as it makes sense to you. It didn't, in fact, but I was fed up talking about it, fed up even thinking about it, so I fetched 2 more Bolero beers and then changed the subject. I told Bosma about my day trip. I'd hired an Opel Record that morning and driven past miles and miles of cattle ranches, through small but impeccable villages, in a wide looping route north of Oranyen. Although I was out of the city for about 5 hours, I'd seen quite enough of the countryside. There was nothing wrong with it. It was agreeably unspoiled rangeland, but it was bland, featureless, lacking in charm or interest, just as I'd been told. Yes, Bosma nodded. I have heard that once you leave the city, it's much the same in every direction for hundreds of miles, although I've never seen for myself. You've never left Oranyen since you got here? Why should I? There's nothing to see or do. His smile broadened into a grin. Is there? Well, no. Do you still have the car? Yes, until tomorrow noon, I told him. It's parked back near the hotel. Good. If you don't mind driving, I would like to show you something. Not exactly a tourist attraction, but I think you'll find it worthwhile. He wouldn't tell me where we were going, but there was still plenty of daylight left when Bosma and I drove away a few minutes later. I followed his directions, and it was soon obvious that we were heading toward the south end of the city. The stockyards, I guessed? Ah, you've seen them. Oh, only from a distance. I told Bosma about the view from the department store. Now you will see it all close up. I was mildly curious. We passed through the commercial district and then a residential area not unlike the one in which I was staying. The houses and squat apartment buildings became shabbier and more dilapidated the further we went from the center of the city. The middle-class in-town neighborhoods gave way to the worker Indian tenements on the outskirts. I wanted to drive slowly so that I could see as much as possible, and in fact, I had to because there were so many people out on the streets. Kids playing games and ignoring the traffic, grown-ups talking in small groups, men to men, women to women, mostly, and old folks sitting stoically wherever they could find a quiet spot. Most of the social life, including the cooking and eating of food, seemed to take place outdoors. Almost before I realized it, we were there. The industry and workers' lodgings had sprung up together over the years without benefit of design or long-term planning. There were row houses right up to the open doors of an abattoir, apartment buildings wedged between a canning factory and a processing plant, and a vast maze of corrals holding thousands of cattle bumping against dozens of tiny backyards. After we had cruised around for a while, I began to understand that these people lived in their workplaces. They would go home when their shift was finished, but home was hardly any different. The interminable stupid bawling of the cattle, the mingled stench of blood, raw meat, and cow shit, the constant rattling of trains, the drumming vibrations of the factories. Everything here, everything you saw or heard or felt or smelled was about decay and death. You could taste it in the air and feel it as a slickness that settled on your skin. We reached the worst of it, a mean stretch where finally the people themselves seemed only marginally alive. They stood or sat about in front of their shacks, looking dazed. The streets, no longer paved, had become increasingly difficult to navigate. Ditches ran along both sides, and they ran red with blood from the slaughterhouses. In the absence of traffic and other human noises, the steady shriek of power saws carving animal flesh was piercingly clear. At every pile of garbage, vicious cats and scarred dogs competed with huge brown roaches and gangs of rats for whatever was going. It was getting dark fast. "I hope you know the way back." "Yes, of course." Bosma gave me a series of directions, and it wasn't too long before we were on a better road. Neither of us had spoken much in the course of our slumming tour. As soon as I caught a glimpse of the lights in the center of the city, my stomach began to relax a little. I had been to some of the worst refugee camps in the world, but never felt so tense. Refugee camps are at least meant to be temporary, and there was always the hope, however slim, of eventual movement. The people I had just seen were never going anywhere. "I suppose I've had Blanca beef many times in my travels," I said, just to say something. "I'm sure you have," Bosma agreed promptly. "They ship it out in every form: brains, tongue, heart, kidneys, liver, as well as all the usual cuts, prime ribs, steaks, and so on, all the way down to hot dogs and Vienna sausages. If it isn't tinned or wrapped in plastic, it's frozen." We began to joke about becoming vegetarians, describing the best salads we could remember having, and we kept at it until we were comfortably settled with drinks in number 1, which was supposedly the better of Iranian's 2 topless joints. It was expensive, but otherwise all right. That kind of bar where the music was loud and the women occasionally distracting was just what Bosma and I needed, since our excursion into the South End had left us in no mood for serious conversation. We drank until the place closed, by which time we were both unfit to drive, so we left the rental car parked where it was and took a taxi. I wasn't surprised when Bosma got out of the cab with me at the hotel. I didn't know exactly where he lived, but I assumed it was in the neighborhood because we met in the beer garden and we always said good night outside the hotel. "Would you like to have a nightcap in my room?" he asked me as the taxi pulled away. "No, thanks very much. I couldn't take another drink." "Are you sure? I have a bottle of Teacher's, pretty good stuff, and I live right there, across the street." Bosma pointed, vaguely to the first or second building on the opposite corner. "Come on, one more." "No, really, thanks. I'm going to fall down and pass out, and I'd rather do that in my bed than on your floor." Bosma shrugged. "Okay. See you tomorrow." "Sure. Good night." I turned away, but then stopped and looked back at him. "Hey, you know what? Your building is one of the ones those ghost soldiers raided." "Don't be telling me such things," he said from the middle of the street. "I don't want to know that." "Why? It's just ghosts in history, right?" "Don't be saying that." Bosma wagged a finger at me and kept going. I somehow made it upstairs, locked my door, and even managed to get my clothes off before spinning dizzily into sleep. It was nearly noon when I opened my eyes again. The first thing that came to me was how nice it felt not to have had another hallucination, nightmare, or ghostly apparition to brood about. I'd been truly out of it, and I'd slept straight through, unbothered. On the negative side, however, I felt terrible the moment I stood up. I took a long shower, which made me feel cleaner, but did nothing for my head, and I was going to get some food when I remembered the rental car. I didn't want to pay another day's charges, but it was already late. When I got to the car, I found a parking ticket under the wiper blade. I shoved it in my pocket, wondering if I could safely tear it up or if the vaunted Iranian police would catch up with me before I flew out next week. The car rental agency wanted me to pay for the second full day, naturally, since I was well over an hour past the deadline when I finally got there. I had no luck arguing until I pulled out my Vogue credentials, at which point the manager became obsequious and sympathetic. No problem. No extra charges. And I got some much-needed food into my stomach. I went back to my hotel room, tore up the parking ticket, and fell asleep again on the bed while trying to read the Herald Tribune. It was after 4 when I dragged myself down to the beer garden. I held off on the alcohol, cautiously sipping a flat mineral water while I waited for Basma. An hour later, I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake. We had agreed to meet in the usual place at the usual time, hadn't we? But maybe he had things to attend to elsewhere, and I'd misunderstood him in the boozy fog last night. I wasn't disappointed or annoyed, because in truth I really wanted a break from Basma's company. For one evening, anyway. I stayed a little longer out of courtesy and then returned to my room. He'd know where to find me if he turned up later. But he didn't, and I had a very welcome early night. The next day I felt great, and I did what I'd really wanted to do all along. I sat in the shade of the beer garden reading Cimino. I had breakfast there, followed later by more coffee, then lunch, and in the middle of the afternoon lemonade and a plate of watermelon chunks. By 5 o'clock I'd knocked off both Maigret novels in the volume, and I was ready to allow myself a glass of cold Bolero beer. It was a very light, pale lager, and I was beginning to develop a taste for it. Where was Basma? I had a sudden guilty flashback to our drunken parting. I'd teased him about the ghost soldiers, as he thought of them, and now it occurred to me that I might have annoyed him. Perhaps that was why he was staying away. What you do when you're drunk always seems much worse when you reconstruct it later. I was tired of sitting there, but once again I stayed on for another hour or so until it was obvious that my Lebanese friend was not going to put in an appearance. I went looking for him a little while later. I started with the corner building diagonally opposite the hotel. Inside the unlocked screen door was a small entry foyer with a tile floor and a rickety wooden table. The inner door was locked, so I rang the bell and kept ringing for nearly 5 minutes before a heavy-set, middle-aged woman answered. "I'm looking for Mr. Basma," I told her. "He go." "When do you expect him back?" She shrugged and shook her head at this. "Well, can I leave a message for him?" I took out a pen and a piece of paper I'd brought for that purpose, but the woman continued to shake her head. "He go," she repeated emphatically. "When will he be back?" "Men come, he go with men." Simple enough, and apparently the end of the story as far as she was concerned. I wasn't ready to give up, however. "What about his things?" "What?" "Things, clothes, belongings. Most people in Blanca can speak English because the local dialect is one of those clotted, homegrown curiosities of limited use, like Afrikaans. But this creature's English was marginal, at best. His possessions, his personal... his things, damn it. Gone." "When did he go?" "Yesterday." "Can I see his room?" "Room?" "Yes, Basma's room, please." "Room, yes, come." It took a while to get there because the woman moved only with difficulty. She showed me into the front room on the first floor. It was a dreary little place with a couch, a couple of chairs, a table, a hideous wardrobe, and a single bed. There was a small bathroom, and behind a plastic curtain, an even smaller galley kitchen. The few items of furniture were old and worn, the walls faded and unadorned, the carpeting thin as newspaper. I went to the window and looked out at the park and the quiet streets. I looked at the balcony and window of my room in the hotel across the way. "Nice view," the woman said. I nodded absently. There was no doubt in my mind that Basma was gone for good. The room had been completely stripped of all personal items. What was there was what you got when you rented a very modest, furnished room. 300 crown 1 month. She waved her hand in a gesture commending the room to me. $100. No. I hurried away. That night I slept by the balcony window in my room. I used the big armchair and stretched my legs out on the coffee table. It was not a comfortable arrangement, but it wasn't unbearable, and I wanted to be there. It seemed important not to miss the apparition if it should occur again. I tried to read for a while, but I could no longer keep my mind on the words. Bosma wouldn't have left so suddenly without saying goodbye, I told myself. From what the woman had said in her skeletal English, he had been taken. And that surely meant taken against his will, but by whom and why? It seemed highly unlikely that his Lebanese enemies would come such a distance to exact revenge, and he'd been so insistent on cautioning me about the Blanca police that I couldn't imagine he'd ever set a foot wrong here. Certainly not in the realm of politics. But Bosma was an entrepreneur, so it was not impossible that he'd gotten involved in some shady deal that had landed him in trouble with the authorities. Could I help him in any way? He'd been good company, a friend. He hadn't tried to con me. He'd been a useful guide to the city. It seemed wrong to just shrug it off mentally and forget about him, but I couldn't think of anything to do other than ask the local police about him, and I was reluctant to do that. It was dawn when I awoke to the sound of car doors slamming. The first thing I saw was a silver Mercedes with black-tinted windows parked at the corner across from my hotel. The car's yellow hazard lights were flashing. 4 men wearing sunglasses and linen suits entered Bosma's building, while they were inside a van with the similarly darkened windows pulled up behind the Mercedes and waited. A moment later, the 4 men reappeared with a 5th man in their custody. He wasn't even handcuffed, but it was obvious he was their prisoner. I stood up, swung the window open, and stepped out onto the balcony. Bosma. I had spoken to myself, barely whispering the man's name in stunned disbelief, but the 5 of them stopped immediately and looked up at me. Bosma looked terrified. I thought I recognized one of the other men. I was so shocked and frightened, however, that I took a step back involuntarily and stumbled, and I had to grab the window frame to catch my balance. Then the scene below was finished, gone as if it had never happened, and I was looking down at an empty street corner. I sat on the bed and lit a cigarette. My hands shook, my head clamored. The smoke was like ground glass in my throat, but I sucked it in deeply as if trying to make a point with my own pain. I'd been so many miles, seen so much of the world, the best and the worst and the endless in-between, but now for the first time in my life I felt lost. Then I became angry with myself. My feelings didn't matter in this situation. Bosma was the one in trouble, and I had to try to help, or at least find out what was happening to him. For all I knew, I was the only friend he had in Blanca. I didn't want to. It scared the shit out of me to think about it, but I had to do something, and now I knew where to start. They came into the beer garden just after 4 o'clock that afternoon, as they had several times during the past week. The woman was as beautiful as ever, cool and formidable, the kind of woman you would fear falling in love with, but love to watch. It was her man, however, who interested me, the man in the linen suit. Bosma had warned me about them. I was pretty sure the man was the officer on horseback I had seen twice. I knew he was one of the men I had seen take Bosma away. Dreams, nightmares, hallucinations, ghosts, take your pick. But maybe the simplest, truest explanation was that I was in the middle of a breakdown caused by the collapse of my marriage and my abrupt flight to this miserable place. It made sense, and I hesitated, clinging to my own weakness. But I was there, Bosma was gone, and that man in the linen suit was very real. I got up at last and went to their table. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I wonder if I could speak to you for a moment." "Yes, why not? Please." He gestured for me to take a seat. They almost looked as if they had been waiting all along for me to approach them, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. "I've seen you around here almost every day since I arrived. I'm on vacation. And the thing is, I can't find a friend of mine. He seems to have disappeared. His name is Bosma. He's a Lebanese businessman. He had a small flat in the corner building across the street. Do you know him?" "I don't think so." "Can you suggest how I might find out about him?" "Go to the police." They both seemed to regard me with an impossible mixture of curiosity and disinterest. I was getting nowhere. He thought maybe you were a policeman. At last, something. The barest flicker of an eyebrow, then the man smiled, as if at some silly misunderstanding. The woman was keenly attentive now. and it was hard for me not to return the all-consuming look in her eyes. "I do work in the government," the man told me. "I am not a policeman. But you are our guest here. Let me ask some people I know about your friend." "Thank you. Of course, I cannot promise you anything." "I understand. Are you staying here?" "Yes." I gave him my name and room number and told him I'd be staying 5 more days. "Thank you for your help. I'm sorry to trouble you." No trouble. Later I felt disgusted at how deferential I'd been, all but groveling for a scrap of information. The man knew Bosma, knew the whole story far better than I did. He was a primary player. "Thank you for your help, but how else could I have handled it? It would have been crazy to confront the man and accuse him of arresting Bosma. It would have been absurd to tell him that history replays itself every morning on that street corner and that I'd seen what he and his colleagues had done. So the possibilities for action on my part were extremely limited. I'd done what I could. I began to think that I should let it go, that it was just one more thing in my life to put behind me. Bosma was rotting in some filthy prison cell if he wasn't already a ghost. In any event, nothing I could do would make the least difference. I might try to write about Bosma and Blanca, something political with teeth in it, but not here, not until I was safely back in New York. I'd never written anything like that before. I slept well that night and did very little the next day. I took a couple of short walks, but mostly hung around the hotel, reading and relaxing. The government man and his beautiful woman did not put in an appearance. I enjoyed another peaceful night. No dreams or ghosts. It was pleasant to idle away afternoons in the beer garden, sipping iced tea and nibbling slivers of chilled melon. I was actually glad that the man in the linen suit failed to show up for the 2nd day in a row. I did think about Bosma now and then. I missed his company, but in my line of work I meet so many people all over the world. Already he was slipping away from me. I calmed down enough to realize I would never write that article. I wasn't equipped to do it properly. Tourism was my beat, not politics or ghosts or mysterious disappearances. To hell with Blanca. Maybe it was a surrender of sorts, but by admitting these things to myself, I felt I was on the way to a kind of mental recovery, and that had been the whole purpose of the trip in the first place. That evening I intended to find some new restaurant and have anything but steak for dinner, then scout a few bars. I was in the mood for serious female contact at last. It was a little past 7 when I stepped out of the hotel. At that instant, the silver Mercedes braked sharply to a halt, and the man in the linen suit jumped out. He came right at me. I was determined not to let this nasty little hood intimidate me any more. "Do you want to see your friend?" "Yes, of course. Where is he?" "I will take you." He gestured toward the open car door. "Please. It is still light." I was aware that the other people on the street all stood motionless, watching. Calmly, at my own pace, I walked to the car and sat down inside. I was in the back seat between the man I knew and another fellow who regarded me warily. I wasn't too surprised to see the beautiful young woman in the front seat along with the driver. She glanced at me once, then looked away. We raced through the center of the city. We were heading south, I knew that much. I asked a few questions, but the only answers I got were vague and unsatisfactory. The driver never slowed down. If anything, he pushed the car a little faster when we reached the crowded working-class district. People and animals sometimes had to jump out of the way at the last second to save themselves. I could sense the others in the car trying not to smile. We passed the factories, the slaughterhouses, the tenements, the stockyards, the grisly processing, canning, and freezing plants. We ripped through the sprawling shantytown and continued beyond the point where Bosma and I had ended our exploration. Finally, we were on a dirt road, crossing a vast, scrubby wasteland. We'd gone a couple of miles when I saw that we were approaching a cluster of vehicles parked with their headlights on, pointing in the same direction. They walked me to the edge of a long ditch about 8 feet deep. It was dusk, not yet too dark to see, but spotlights had been hooked up to a generator to illuminate the scene. It was all so bright it hurt my eyes. Perhaps a dozen other men stood about, smoking, talking quietly, taking notes and photographs. When my eyes adjusted, I forced myself to look carefully. There were a lot of bodies in the ditch. I would estimate at least 20. All the same. Hands tied behind the back of the head partially blown away. floating features. I noticed the swarming insects, the ferocious smell. I stood there for a while staring, but so help me, I could not put together a single thought. A couple of men wearing goggles and masks were getting ready to spray the ditch with some chemical. "Can you identify that person?" the man in the linen suit asked me, pointing to a particular corpse. "There." "Yes, that's him." In spite of the puffed face, parts of which had already been nibbled at by animals, I had no difficulty picking up my legged friend. "That's Bosma." "I'm so sorry," he said quite casually. "It is a terrible way to die." As if there are any good ones. "Why did this happen to him?" I asked. "He was a harmless little man, a foreign guest in this country. Why should they," I almost said you, but managed to avoid it, "do this to him?" "Come here, please." He led me back to the car where the young woman waited. She looked smart as ever, this time in a tropical pantsuit with a white blouse open, 3 buttons deep. The man nodded to her. She reached into a leather briefcase I hadn't noticed and handed him something. He held it up for me to see. My eyes lingered on hers for a moment, but her look gave nothing away. "Did you do this?" I could feel the blood vacating my cheeks, then rushing back as I tried to muster a sense of embarrassed contempt. He had a large rectangle of cardboard on which were pasted all the torn pieces of my parking ticket. "Yes, we do that all the time. Back in New York, I hope it's not a felony here. I'm willing to pay the fine, whatever it is. And I'll pay it now, if you like." "Did you refuse to pay a late fee to Bolero Rent-A-Car, and did you threaten to write negative comments about that agency in your travel articles and foreign publications?" I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. "I was about an hour late, but I explained the situation to them, and they seemed to be satisfied. If you're not, I'd be glad to pay the fee." "May I have your passport?" I gave it to him. "Why?" "You can get in the car now. An officer will drive you back to your hotel. Thank you for your help." "I need my passport," I told him. "I'm flying home in 3 days, Sunday afternoon." "I know," he replied. "We will contact you." I tried to talk to the driver on the journey back into town, but he ignored me. I was furious, but frightened as well. The whole thing was a grotesque charade. They didn't need me to identify Bosma, but they made me go through with it, knowing that I wouldn't have the courage to accuse them of his murder. "Take a good look in that ditch," they were saying to me. "This is the kind of thing we can do." They were toying with me, because it's their nature to toy with people. What, if anything, could Bosma have done to bring about his own destruction at the hands of these people? Perhaps he'd been involved in some way with a radical faction in Lebanon. Did the authorities here think they were eliminating a Muslim terrorist? Was he a crook or a smuggler, a charming criminal who'd escaped from Beirut only to run out of luck in Blanca? To me, he seemed a pleasant, fairly idle fellow with an agreeable manner and a taste for godless liquor, but in fairness, I hardly knew him. We had a few dinners together, a lot of drinks, that was all. It was a brief acquaintance. Our backgrounds and our circumstances were totally different. They couldn't do that to me. All the same, I decided to take certain precautions. The next morning I tried to contact the nearest American consulate, which was some 400 miles away. At first the operator of the hotel switchboard told me that all long-distance lines out of or on Yen were engaged. After an hour of fruitless attempts, she said she had learned that they were down, and that she had no idea how long it would be before they were working again. I went to the main post office and tried again. Same result. I tried to rent another car at a different agency. I'm not sure what I intended to do with it, drive away, I suppose, right out of the country, but I was refused one because I could not produce my passport. I didn't bother with lunch. I drank a couple of beers and smoked a lot of cigarettes. I wandered around until I found the railroad station. I bought a ticket on the next departing train, although I wasn't even sure where it was going, and a uniformed policeman confiscated the ticket, smiling. "We don't want you to disappear on us, sir." Of course not. They got the parking ticket from the wastebasket in my room. They had talked with the rental agency about me. They had been watching and following me all the time. It was pointless to wonder why. I went back to the hotel, and as calmly as possible I wrote a letter to my lawyer in New York telling him where I was, that I had a problem with the authorities, and that if he hadn't heard from me, my voice on the telephone by the time he got the letter, he was to do whatever it took to get me out of Blanca. Press conferences, congressmen, the State Department, the works. I wrote more or less the same thing to my editor. I used the hotel stationery and did not write my name on the envelopes. The hotel was unsafe, and so were the streets, but I thought my chances were a little better outdoors. I went for a walk and slipped the letters into the mailbox on the corner as inconspicuously as possible. I crossed into the park and sat on the bench for a while, smoking. Nothing happened. I got back to my room just in time to glance out the window and see a silver Mercedes pull away from the mailbox. This is my last night in Blanca. Tomorrow I'm supposed to be on the noon flight out of here. I still have that ticket. I still do not have my passport. For 2 days and 2 nights I've waited. Nothing happens. I am waiting. There's nowhere to go, nothing to do, except smoke and drink and wait. I think of them all the time. The handsome man in the linen suit and the beautiful young woman. Mostly I think of her, with her blouse open, 3 buttons deep. Her breasts are not large, because I saw no cleavage, but I know they are perfect. Her skin finely tanned with the faintest trace of sun bleached down. I'd like to have her, to lick her, but she's impossible to touch. I can only look at a woman like that and wonder what it would be like to fuck death. Tonight when I ask at the desk for a wake-up call, they smile and say, yes, of course, and smile some more. No one writes it down. The porter says I don't look well. Would I like dinner in my room? Some company? Clean, he adds encouragingly. It'll be over long before noon. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, the silver Mercedes will arrive, the van right behind. The men in the van are there to strip the room of my possessions after I'm gone. Some morning in the future, you can look out one of these windows and see how it happened. Too late for me. And for you. I crush out a cigarette, I open another bottle of beer, reach for another cigarette. I don't have to go to the window to see what's happening outside. There's light in the sky. Look for me.
The end. Music by Jordan Peer. This has been a Watertown Arts production.